History is filled with horrors we think we understand. We understand the physical brutality of war. We understand the biological devastation of the Black Death. We can track them with maps, statistics, and science. But what happens when the threat isn't a weapon or a bacterium? What happens when the killer is an idea? An invisible, contagious madness that hijacks the human mind, turns the body into a prison, and forces you to tear yourself apart from the inside out. In the scorching summer of 1518, in the heart of the Holy Roman Empire, a bizarre and terrifying phenomenon struck the city of Strasbourg. Without warning, a woman stepped into the street and began to dance. She didn't stop for an hour. She didn't stop when night fell. She didn't stop when her feet cracked open and stained the earth red. And within days, she wasn't alone. This was not a celebration. It was an execution. Dozens, then hundreds of citizens were gripped by an uncontrollable compulsion to move. They danced through agonizing heat, through dehydration, through fractured bones. They danced until their hearts literally exploded inside their chests, or until their strokes left them paralyzed on the pavement. To comprehend how such a bizarre tragedy could take hold of an entire population, we must first dismantle everything we think we know about the Renaissance. We often view the early 16th century as an era of enlightenment, art, and discovery. But for the average citizen living within the walls of Strasbourg in 1518, reality was an absolute living nightmare. The world did not feel enlightened. It felt condemned. The year leading up to the crisis had been catastrophic. The region was trapped in the grip of a ruthless mini ice age. Severe, unpredictable weather had completely decimated the local agriculture. The wheat fields had rotted in the ground. The vineyards had frozen solid. Food prices skyrocketed to levels that ordinary citizens could not comprehend, let alone afford. Bread, the single thread keeping the working class alive, became a luxury. Famine quickly brought its close companion, disease. But this wasn't just any ordinary sickness. The city was facing a dual assault of unprecedented horror. First came the traditional killer, typhus, sweeping through the malnourished population like wildfire. But second was a terrifying, new, and deeply stigmatized disease that had recently crossed into Europe: syphilis. Contemporaries called it the Great Pox. It was a disease that didn't just kill, it humiliated its victims, rotting the flesh off their faces, destroying their nervous systems, and driving them mad before they died. To the deeply religious mindset of the 16th century, this wasn't a biological coincidence. This was divine wrath. The people of Strasbourg looked at their empty plates, their rotting skin, and the black clouds above them, and they reached a singular, terrifying conclusion. God had abandoned them. Or worse, he was preparing to destroy them entirely. In this psychological pressure cooker, emotional survival became impossible. Chronic malnutrition alters brain chemistry, increasing vulnerability to hallucinations and panic. Combine that physiological frailty with an absolute, overwhelming terror of eternal damnation, and you get a population whose collective nervous system was frayed to the absolute limit. Strasbourg was a powder keg of trauma, anxiety, and despair. All it needed was a single spark. That spark was struck on an ordinary, suffocatingly hot Tuesday in mid-July, 1518. The door of a small house opened, and a woman stepped out into the narrow, crowded street. Her name was Frau Trophea. She did not speak, she did not cry out. She simply stood in the middle of the alleyway, closed her eyes, and began to move her body. To the neighbors who stopped to watch, it initially looked like a domestic dispute or a bizarre public outburst. Perhaps she had fought with her husband. Perhaps she had simply broken under the stress of the famine. They expected her to stop within minutes, to collapse from exhaustion, or to be dragged back inside by her family. But Frau Trophea didn't stop. An hour passed, then 2, then 6. The sun dipped below the city walls, plunging Strasbourg into darkness. Yet Frau Trophea continued to spin and leap through the shadows. Her muscles must have been screaming with lactic acid. Her feet were blistered and bleeding inside her shoes. Yet her face remained completely blank, staring forward into the dark, as if she were completely blind to the world around her. She danced through the entire night. When the sun rose on Wednesday morning, the townspeople returned to the street, fully expecting to find a corpse. Instead, they found Frau Trophea still moving, her clothes stiff with dried sweat and blood, her body trembling with absolute exhaustion, yet utterly unable to stop. For 6 straight days, this single woman turned the streets of Strasbourg into her own personal purgatory. No matter how much her husband pleaded, no matter how much her body deteriorated, the invisible force held her in its grip. But the true horror of the situation didn't realize itself until the end of that first week. Because as the townspeople watched her body slowly fall apart, something in the collective consciousness of the crowd began to snap. The madness was no longer confined to a single mind. It was looking for new hosts. By the end of the first week, Frau Trophea was finally removed from the streets. Local authorities, deeply unnerved by her unnatural endurance, bundled her into a wooden cart and sent her away to a shrine in the nearby Vosges Mountains, hoping a blessing from St. Vitus would cure her shattered mind. But it was already too late. The psychological virus she carried had already leaked into the air of Strasbourg. Within 48 hours of her departure, the streets were no longer silent. On the very corner where Frau Trophea had shed her blood, 3 more women stepped out and began to mimic her movements. They didn't speak to one another. There was no shared rhythm, no music, no coordination. Each woman was locked in her own private hell, jerking and spinning as if attempting to escape their own skin. By the end of that weekend, the number grew from 3 to over 30. Within another week, it was 100. By early August, more than 400 people were dancing across the public squares of Strasbourg. To understand the mechanics of this horror, you must erase the image of a modern, joyful dance from your mind. This was a meat grinder. The human body is equipped with natural pain barriers. When a muscle tears or a bone cracks, your brain screams at you to stop. But the people of Strasbourg had lost control of their steering wheels. Their conscious minds were trapped inside screaming bodies that refused to obey them. Eyewitnesses, including local chroniclers and magistrates, recorded scenes of unimaginable anatomical brutality. Men and women danced until the skin on the soles of their feet completely wore away, exposing raw muscle and white bone. They danced with fractured ankles, with dislocated hips, through blinding heat strokes. Dehydration hollowed out their eyes, turning their faces into living skulls. Yet they kept moving. Imagine the psychological torment. You are completely conscious. You see your family crying on the sidelines, begging you to sit down. You feel every agonizing tear in your ligaments. You want nothing more than to drop to the cold stone and rest. But your legs continue to pump, your arms continue to flail, and your torso continues to twist. You are a passenger in a vehicle that is accelerating toward a brick wall. And then, the deaths began.
At the height of the epidemic in August, the dancing plague was claiming up to 15 lives every single day. The public squares became open-air morgues. A dancer would be in the middle of a frantic spin, and suddenly their face would turn ash gray. They would clutch their chest and collapse heavily onto the pavement, their heart literally ruptured by days of non-stop cardio under a blistering summer sun. Others would suffer massive strokes, their brains bleeding from the sheer unmitigated physical stress, leaving their bodies to twitch erratically on the ground even after their consciousness had faded.
As the bodies piled up, panic turned into sheer, unadulterated chaos. The city's economy ground to an absolute halt. Bakers left their ovens cold, blacksmiths dropped their hammers, merchants abandoned their stalls. No one was buying, no one was selling, and no one was farming. The entire infrastructure of Strasbourg was being systematically dismantled by an invisible monster. Desperate for a solution, the city's ruling council, the magistrate, convened an emergency meeting. They were staring at a crisis that defied everything they knew about reality. They called upon the highest authority available to them, the prominent physicians of the region. In 1518, medicine was a bizarre cocktail of ancient Greek philosophy and religious superstition. Doctors believed the human body was governed by 4 primary fluids, or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If these fluids fell out of balance, madness or disease followed. After examining the foaming, bleeding dancers from a safe distance, the medical elite of Strasbourg delivered a diagnosis that would go down as one of the most disastrous errors in human history. They rejected the idea that this was a spiritual curse or a demonic possession. Instead, they declared that the epidemic was caused by a purely natural phenomenon: hot blood.
According to their theory, the brains of these citizens had become overheated due to a severe chemical imbalance in their humors. The heat was creating a literal physical pressure inside their skulls, and the body's automatic survival mechanism was forcing them to dance to burn off the excess heat. It was a mechanical problem, the doctor said. The steam needed to be let out of the boiler. Had the doctors recommended bloodletting or isolation, the epidemic might have been contained. But instead, the magistrate took the doctor's theory to its literal, terrifying logical conclusion. If these people needed to dance to cool their blood, then the city must help them dance harder, faster, and without interruption. The government decided to optimize the plague. The magistrate hired professional carpenters to clear out the crowded marketplaces. In the center of the city, they constructed massive wooden stages, designed specifically to hold dozens of dancers at once. They cleared out public halls and grain markets, converting them into indoor dancing arenas. But they didn't stop there. Believing that the dancers were slowing down out of mere physical fatigue rather than being cured, the city council dipped into the public treasury and hired dozens of professional musicians. Pipers, drummers, and fiddlers were brought into the squares. They were ordered to play loud, fast, high-energy traditional melodies 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The strategy was simple: turn the tragedy into an organized marathon. Force the victims to dance until the hot blood evaporated from their systems. To ensure the dancers never dropped from simple exhaustion, the city even hired strong, healthy men to act as helpers. These men were paid to step onto the platforms, grab the collapsing, semi-conscious dancers by their arms, and physically prop them up, forcing their dragging feet to keep moving to the beat of the drums. It was a scene straight out of a fever dream. A medieval metropolis, already starving and plagued by disease, now transformed into a massive, government-funded, non-stop festival of death. The air was filled with the deafening, upbeat rhythm of drums and pipes, juxtaposed against the visceral groans, screams, and weeping of hundreds of people who were being forced to dance themselves to pieces. The magistrate expected a medical miracle. What they actually created was a human amplifier.
Instead of curing the victims, the loud music, the open stages, and the public spectacle acted like gasoline thrown onto a roaring fire. The visual and auditory cues provided a rhythm for the madness to attach itself to. Healthy citizens who had merely walked down to the square to watch the spectacle found themselves locked onto the hypnotic thud of the drums. Their own legs began to twitch. Their own minds snapped. Within days of the musicians arriving, the number of infected citizens doubled. The very interventions designed to save the city had turned Strasbourg into a hyper-efficient slaughterhouse. The wooden stages were slick with blood and sweat. The musicians played until their own fingers bled, while around them, the citizens they were trying to cure fell dead, one by one, beneath the shadow of the cathedral. When the drums failed and the wooden stages turned into platforms of slaughter, the psychological facade of Strasbourg completely shattered. The citizens realized that human medicine and government intellect were utterly powerless against the entity that had seized them. As the music was finally silenced and the musicians dismissed in disgrace, a heavy, terrifying realization settled over the city. This was not a disease of the flesh. It was a sentence handed down from the heavens. To the medieval mind, everything in the universe operated on a strict spiritual ledger. If an individual or a city suffered, it was because a debt of sin had been called due. The people looked at the hundreds of dancers still jerking and groaning in the mud, and they assigned a name to their executioner: Saint Vitus.
Saint Vitus was a Christian martyr from the 4th century, a young man who had been tortured and executed by the Roman Emperor Diocletian. According to Catholic tradition, Vitus held immense spiritual jurisdiction over neurological disorders, epilepsy, and hysteria. But in the volatile cultural landscape of 16th century Germany, Saint Vitus was viewed with a terrifying duality. He was a protector, yes, but he was also a vengeful deity, capable of inflicting a unique, inescapable curse upon those who desecrated his holy days or mocked his name. The curse of Saint Vitus was whispered about in dark corners long before 1518. It was believed that if you angered the saint, he would strike your mind with a divine fire, forcing you to dance in a state of eternal, agonizing penance until you begged for his mercy. The dancers in the streets were no longer seen as patients. They were seen as living monuments of divine anger. But as the priests climbed into their pulpits to scream about repentance, the educated elite began to look backward through the pages of old chronicles. They discovered a deeply disturbing truth. The catastrophe in Strasbourg was not unique. It was merely the largest and most explosive eruption of a psychological parasite that had been dormant in the human collective consciousness for centuries. The historical archives revealed that Europe had been periodically terrorized by these dancing manias, or chorea lasciva, for nearly 500 years. The earliest massive outbreak had occurred centuries earlier, on Christmas Eve in the year 1021, in the German town of Kolbig. According to local historical accounts, 18 citizens had gathered outside the church of St. Magnus
disrupting the Christmas Mass by shouting, singing, and dancing in a wild, profane circle. The priest, driven to madness by their disrespect, allegedly prayed to God and St. Magnus to punish them. The chronicle states that the dancers were instantly locked into their frantic circle, unable to break hands or stop moving for an entire calendar year. 3 of them died from exhaustion the moment the curse finally lifted. The survivors spent the rest of their short lives trembling with permanent neurological tremors. 2 centuries later, in 1278, the madness struck again, this time on a massive stone bridge over the River Meuse in Germany. 200 people suddenly converged on the bridge, jumping, spinning, and stomping with such violent, synchronized force that the heavy stone architecture fractured beneath their feet. The bridge collapsed, plunging the screaming, twisting crowd into the dark waters below. The survivors were dragged out of the river, their bodies still twitching, and were immediately locked away in a nearby monastery dedicated to, once again, Saint Vitus. But the true predecessor to Strasbourg occurred in the summer of 1374 along the banks of the Rhine River. An epidemic of staggering proportions tore through Aix-la-Chapelle, Cologne, and Utrecht. Thousands of people suddenly abandoned their homes, stripped off their clothes, and flooded into the public squares. The accounts from 1374 paint a picture of absolute, unmitigated demonic chaos. Unlike the Strasbourg dancers, who moved in silent, hollow agony, these victims screamed of terrifying, apocalyptic visions. They claimed the air around them was filled with rivers of human blood, and that they could see the heavens opening up to reveal an angry, vengeful Christ. They danced in massive, writhing masses, foaming at the mouth, until their abdominal muscles grew so tightly knotted that they wrapped linen cloths tightly around their stomachs just to keep from tearing themselves apart. As the historians in Strasbourg read these accounts, they noticed a terrifying pattern. These outbreaks did not strike during times of peace and prosperity. They occurred during periods of absolute, crushing, existential terror. The 1374 outbreak had hit immediately after the Black Death had wiped out a third of the European population. The Kolbig outbreak had occurred during a period of apocalyptic fear surrounding the turn of the millennium. The human mind, when pushed past the absolute limit of psychological endurance, possesses a terrifying defense mechanism. It adapts to the cultural folklore of its time. In the 16th century, if a community believed deeply enough in a curse, their extreme trauma could manifest that exact curse into physical reality. And it wasn't just dancing. The archives showed that mass psychological infection could take on whatever shape the culture feared most. In the closed, oppressive environments of medieval nunneries, where young women were forced into lives of isolation, religious guilt, and harsh discipline, the mind would snap in even more bizarre ways. Chronicles record the famous epidemic of the meowing nuns. In a French convent, a single nun suddenly began to meow like a cat. Within days, every single nun in the cloister was meowing in unison for hours at a time, creating a chorus of feline screaming that terrified the surrounding village. In Germany, another convent was struck by an epidemic of biting nuns, where a single sister began to bite her companions, triggering a chain reaction that spread through dozens of monasteries across Germany and Holland, as nuns locked themselves in rooms, violently gnawing on each other's flesh. The lesson of history was clear, and it was deeply unsettling for the authorities of Strasbourg. They weren't fighting a physical disease that could be quarantined or cured with medicine. They were fighting the human mind's ultimate, desperate escape hatch from reality. The city was trapped in a feedback loop of collective hysteria. The more people danced, the more the crowd believed the curse was real. And the more they believed the curse was real, the more minds snapped and joined the slaughter.
The dancing plague of 1518 eventually burned itself out in the autumn of that year. As the cold winds of September arrived, the exhausted, malnourished survivors were systematically rounded up, bound with ropes, and taken away to the grotto of St. Vitus in Severn. There, their bloody feet were placed into red shoes blessed by the priests, and they were led around the altar of the saint. Whether through the psychological relief of absolution or simple biological exhaustion, the convulsions finally ceased. The music stopped. The dead were buried.
For centuries, this event was treated as a bizarre fable, an exaggerated myth from a superstitious and uneducated era. But as modern science advanced, researchers, toxicologists, and historians returned to the archives of Strasbourg. They discovered that the municipal records, the medical logs, and the eyewitness accounts were completely authentic. The event had actually happened. This realization triggered a massive, multidisciplinary scientific investigation. Modern science demanded an answer. What could physically possess hundreds of people to dance themselves to death? For decades, the dominant scientific explanation was a theory known as ergotism, popularly referred to as the medieval LSD theory.
Ergot is a dark, parasitic fungus that grows on grain, particularly rye, during damp, cold growing seasons, the exact weather conditions that Strasbourg experienced in the years leading up to 1518. When contaminated rye is harvested and ground into flour, the population unwittingly consumes a toxic cocktail of chemicals known as ergot alkaloids. Chemically, these alkaloids are direct precursors to lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD. When a human being consumes ergot-poisoned bread, they develop a condition known historically as St. Anthony's fire. The drug triggers massive, violent muscle spasms, severe convulsions, and intense, terrifying hallucinations. It constricts the blood vessels, causing a burning sensation in the limbs that can eventually lead to gangrene, causing fingers and toes to literally rot and fall off. To many modern researchers, the pieces of the puzzle seem to fit perfectly. The famine had forced the poor of Strasbourg to eat degraded, moldy grain. The mold contained a natural form of LSD. The entire city was undergoing a massive, involuntary, catastrophic drug trip. It explained the hallucinations, the madness, and the physical convulsions. But as historians dug deeper into the specific mechanics of the Strasbourg outbreak, the ergot theory began to completely fall apart under scientific scrutiny. First, there is the problem of pharmacology. While ergot contains hallucinogenic properties, it is also a brutal, debilitating physical poison. A person suffering from severe ergot poisoning is not capable of running a marathon. They are trapped in their beds, vomiting, suffering from violent, uncoordinated seizures, and crippled by the intense pain of gangrene as their blood flow cuts off. The idea that 400 people could ingest enough ergot to drive them insane, yet remain physically capable of dancing non-stop for days on end under a scorching August sun, is medically impossible. Furthermore, ergot poisoning does not cause coordinated, sustained behavior. It causes chaos. It does not look like a rhythmic, continuous stomp that lasts for weeks. It looks like a medical emergency. And then there is the final, fatal flaw of the chemical theory. The infection spread over time. If the dancing plague was caused simply by a bad batch of bread, everyone who ate the flour would have fallen ill simultaneously. But that is not what happened. It began with one woman, Frau Trophea. It took a week to spread to 30 people and a month to reach 400. A chemical poison in food does not select its victims linearly over the course of 30 days. If it wasn't a drug, and it wasn't a biological virus, then science is left with only one remaining verdict. A verdict that is far more terrifying than any toxic mold or ancient bacterium.
Strasbourg was a victim of mass psychogenic illness, a catastrophic, collective psychological meltdown. Modern psychiatry knows that under conditions of extreme, prolonged, and inescapable stress, the human brain can trigger a conversion disorder. The psychological trauma, unable to be processed emotionally, converts itself into real physical symptoms. Tourette-like tics, paralysis, blindness, and uncontrollable convulsions can manifest out of nothing but thin air. But for a mass psychogenic illness to spread like a wildfire through a population, it requires a specific environment. It requires a population that shares the exact same fears, the exact same cultural beliefs, and the exact same expectations. Strasbourg in 1518 was the perfect laboratory. Every single citizen shared the absolute certainty that St. Vitus could curse them with a fatal dance. Every single citizen was starving, traumatized by disease, and living in terror of immediate death. When Frau Trophia stepped into the street, her brain had simply broken under the weight of her reality. Her conversion disorder manifested as a frantic dance. But to the thousands of traumatized citizens watching her, they didn't see a psychiatric breakdown. They saw the physical proof that the curse had begun. The sight of her movement unlocked the latent, repressed terror inside the minds of the onlookers. Their own nervous systems, already raw from starvation and anxiety, adopted the symptom. The dance became a highly contagious behavioral virus. It was a physical manifestation of a collective panic attack, amplified by the city's disastrous decision to add music and stages, which provided a physical structure for the hysteria to lock onto. They danced because they believed they had to. They died because their minds convinced their bodies that survival was no longer an option. The empty squares of Strasbourg eventually grew quiet, but the ghost of 1518 still hovers over modern science. We look back at the medieval citizens with a sense of arrogant detachment. We tell ourselves that we are too educated, too rational, and too technologically advanced to ever fall victim to an invisible monster born of mere belief. But we must remember that human biology has not changed. The wiring of our brains, the architecture of our nervous systems, and our fundamental vulnerability to panic are identical to those of the peasants who stood beneath the Strasbourg Cathedral 500 years ago. Our world is no longer connected by narrow mud streets, but by fiber optic cables and digital algorithms. Information, fear, and panic can now travel across the entire planet in a fraction of a second, flooding our collective consciousness with unprecedented levels of chronic, inescapable stress. We no longer fear the curse of St. Vitus or the wrath of ancient saints, but we must ask ourselves a deeply uncomfortable question. In our hyper-connected, deeply anxious modern world, what is our spark? What is the invisible, contagious idea waiting to hijack our minds? And if the drums start playing tomorrow, will you be strong enough to keep your feet from moving?